The number was still there when she woke up. Lyra Vasic did not know her own name yet. She knew that in the way you know you are lying on something cold, not as a fact retrieved, but as an absence felt, a socket where something used to be. She was on her back on a metal floor. Overhead, daylight poured through a bank of translucent ceiling panels, bright and clinical, the kind of institutional lighting that exists in places where people are processed rather than welcomed. Her head throbbed. Her mouth tasted like copper. Her left wrist was burning. She lifted the wrist and looked at it. 6 digits, tattooed in black ink on the soft skin of her inner forearm, just below the heel of her palm. The numbers were small, precise, clearly done by a steady hand. They read 91,447. She did not know what they meant. She did not know where she was, or how she had gotten here, or why the floor was cold, or why the burning in her wrist felt old, not the sharp sting of fresh ink, but the settled ache of something healed over, a mark that had been there for weeks or months. She pressed her thumb against the digits. The skin was smooth. The ink was deep. A door opened. Daylight shifted as a figure entered, tall, narrow, moving with the measured precision of something that had never needed to hurry in its entire evolutionary history. Vothran. The name came to her from somewhere below conscious recall, rising like a bubble from sediment. A species name. She knew it the way she knew how to breathe, automatically, without choosing to. The Vothran who entered was female, or what passed for female in their reproductive taxonomy. Nearly 2.5 meters tall, her frame draped in layered thermal reactive fabric that shifted between pale gray and the faintest green as her body temperature changed. Her face was vertically elongated, 3 tiers of sensory apertures stacked above a narrow, lipless mouth. The upper tier olfactory. The middle visual, a pair of wide amber lenses that reflected the ceiling light. The lower auditory and barometric, a set of membranous openings that flexed with each shift in air pressure. The Vothran looked at her wrist. "You have written on yourself again," the Vothran said. Her voice was low, unhurried, with a harmonic undertone that vibrated in the bones of Lyra's jaw. "This is the 4th time." Lyra's mouth opened. Nothing came out. She tried again. "Who am I?" The Vothran's middle sensory tier narrowed, the amber lenses contracting to thin vertical slits. In Vothran body language, this was neither surprise nor displeasure. It was measurement. She was reading Lyra's vitals through her skin, her breath, the micro-tremors in her voice. "You are Dr. Lyra Vasic," the Vothran said. "Human, xenobiologist, research fellow, seconded to the Vothran Continuance Institute under Bilateral Exchange Protocol 1190. You have been with us for 22 months. You are on the research station Ilran Ka in orbit above Deleth Vor. The current date is..." "Why don't I remember any of that?" The Vothran paused. The thermal fabric shifted from gray to a deeper green, cooler body temperature, which in their physiology correlated with heightened cognitive processing. She was choosing her words. "You underwent a therapeutic memory realignment," the Vothran said. "A standard procedure. You consented to it. The consent record is on file." "And the 3 times before?" "Also consensual, also on file." Lyra looked at the number on her wrist. 91,447. She pressed her thumb against it again, harder this time, as if she could push through the ink and reach whatever was underneath. "What does this number mean?" "We do not know. You wrote it on yourself before the procedure. You have done so before each of the previous 3 procedures as well. The same 6 digits, the same location. The same ink compound, synthesized from materials available in the station's general supply dispensary. We have asked you each time what the number means. Each time, you have been unable to tell us, because the memory of writing it has been included in the realignment scope. So I write a number on my arm that I can't explain, and then you erase my memory of writing it. The realignment addresses the distress that prompted you to request it. The number is an incidental artifact." An artifact of what? The Vothran's lower sensory tier flexed barometric membranes dilating. She could hear the change in Lyra's heartbeat. She could feel the shift in air pressure as Lyra's breathing quickened. She stood very still, the way Vothran stood when they were waiting for a biological system to stabilize before applying the next input. Of your work, the Vothran said, which is classified. Lyra sat up. The floor was cold through the thin fabric of the medical gown they had put on her. The room was small, a recovery suite, she guessed, though she had no memory of any recovery suite. A sleep platform against one wall, a diagnostic panel on another, a viewport showing the amber and slate banding of a gas giant's upper atmosphere, lit by a distant sun. Daylight flooded the room from the ceiling panels, casting no shadows. Classified by whom? By the Continuance Council, per standard protocol for research findings that carry civilizational stability implications. My research? That I can't remember doing. Correct. The Vothran stood in the doorway, patient, measured, her thermal fabric cycling through the slow greens and grays of composed deliberation. She was not hostile. Lyra could read that much even without memories, the body language, the distance she maintained, the way she kept her sensory apertures open rather than narrowed. She was not guarding Lyra. She was monitoring her, the way a physician monitors a patient emerging from anesthesia. My name, Lyra said. Dr. Lyra Vasek. And yours? Senior Attendant Keyleth. I have overseen your recovery after each procedure. All 4 times. All 4 times. Lyra looked at her wrist one more time. The digits were crisp. Black ink settled into the dermal layer, permanent unless someone cut the skin away. She did not know why she had chosen those specific numbers, or what they meant, or why they burned with a low, persistent heat that felt less like healing and more like insistence. But she knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought, that they were important. 14 days later, Lyra found the first note. She had been settling into the routines the Vothran provided, a structured schedule of meals, exercise, cognitive rehabilitation sessions, and supervised access to the station's common areas. Ilran-Ka was a research platform, roughly cylindrical, orbiting a gas giant whose upper atmosphere churned in bands of amber and slate. The station's interior was bright. The Vothran preferred high-lumen environments, their visual processing optimized for conditions that would make most humans squint. Every corridor was flooded with daylight spectrum illumination from ceiling panels that tracked the planet's rotational period. Shadows were scarce. Privacy was architectural rather than optical. The Vothran partitioned space with translucent barriers that muffled sound but transmitted light, so every room existed in a perpetual state of bright, supervised visibility. Lyra's quarters were a single room with a sleep platform, a hygiene alcove, and a work surface bolted to the wall. The work surface was bare. Her personal effects, what remained of them, occupied a single shelf. 3 changes of clothing in the Vothran issue thermal fabric, a pair of standard gravity boots, a hygiene kit, and a small case containing writing instruments and a notebook. The notebook was the problem. It was a physical object, actual paper, bound with a synthetic spine, the kind of thing humans carried in their personal kits because they were tactile creatures who liked to write by hand even in an age of neural-linked data interfaces. The Vothran had not confiscated it. They had, Lyra suspected, considered it harmless. Paper was not a data storage medium in any system they recognized as significant. Their own record-keeping was neurochemical, encoded in engineered protein chains and stored in biological archive matrices that could hold a civilization's entire history in a volume the size of a human fist. A paper notebook was, to them, something between a curiosity and a toy. Lyra opened the notebook on the 14th day because she had run out of other things to do, and she found handwriting on the first page. Her handwriting. She recognized the slant, the pressure patterns, the way certain letters leaned right when she wrote quickly and straightened when she slowed down. The entry was undated. It read, "If you are reading this, you have forgotten again. The number on your wrist is a frequency, 91.447 megahertz. It is the resonant frequency of the protein lattice in the archive vault on sublevel 4. You discovered something in that lattice. They do not want you to remember what it is. Do not consent to another realignment. Find sublevel 4. Bring the spectrometer from the biology lab cabinet 3, second shelf, behind the calibration weights. The lattice will respond to a 91.447 MHz carrier wave modulated at 0.3 amplitude. What you find will explain everything." She read it 3 times. Then she turned the page. The second page was in her handwriting too, but different, the letters tighter, the pressure heavier, the slant more pronounced. A different version of her. An earlier version or a later one. She could not tell which. "This is the 3rd time. They will realign you again. I am writing this because last time I did not leave a note, and I lost 4 months before I found the frequency again by accident. My hands dialed it on a spectrometer during a routine calibration exercise, and the protein sample on the bench began to vibrate. 4 months of living in a comfortable fog before my fingers found the number my mind couldn't hold. Do not waste those months. The Vothran are not hostile. They believe they are helping you. Their realignment technology is the most precise neurological tool any species has ever produced. They can remove a single memory without disturbing the tissue around it. They have been doing this for 11,000 years. They are very good at it. They are also very frightened of what you found, and their fear expresses itself as procedure. They will not harm you. They will simply keep smoothing you until the wrinkle is gone. You are the wrinkle. The number on your wrist is the only thing they cannot smooth, because they do not understand why you keep writing it. They think it is a compulsion. It is not a compulsion. It is the one piece of the answer that your hands remember even when your mind does not. 91,447. The 3rd page was in a different hand, again shakier, the letters uneven. The ink smudged in places as if the writer's hands had been trembling or the pen had been nearly dry. 2nd time. Head hurts worse this time. Floor is cold. Keyleth is patient. They are always patient. The frequency is real. I saw what the lattice contains, and I cannot write the full details here because if they find this notebook they will include it in the next realignment scope and I will lose the thread entirely. I can only write the number and the location. The number is the key. The number is you. The number is the thing you did that no one else could do, and they cannot take it because it lives in your muscles, not your memory. 91,447. Sublevel 4, last vault, far wall. Go. See for yourself, and when you see it, do not tell them you have seen it, not until you have the data copied. They will not hurt you, but they will smooth you, and if you don't have the evidence written down in a form they cannot erase, the cycle starts again. Trust your hands. Your hands know. A 4th page. This one was brief, the letters precise, and unhurried, the handwriting of someone who was not yet frightened, not yet frantic, someone writing the first note in what she did not yet know would become a series. I am Dr. Lyra Vasek. I am a xenobiologist. I have made a discovery that the Vothran Continuance Institute does not want published, verified, or even remembered. I have requested a therapeutic memory realignment because the weight of knowing has become more than I can carry alone, and they are the only species that can lighten the load. But I do not trust myself to stay lightened. I know who I am. I am the kind of person who needs to know. So I am leaving myself this, 91,447, a frequency, a key, a promise. If I have forgotten everything else, I have not forgotten how to follow a lead. Lyra closed the notebook. She sat on the edge of the sleep platform, the notebook in her lap, the bright Vothran light pouring over her from every direction, and she looked at the 6 digits on her wrist. 4 versions of her, 4 entries, each one written by a woman she could not remember being, each one addressing a woman who did not yet exist. The handwriting changed tighter, shakier, more urgent, but the number never did. 91,447. A frequency. She closed the notebook and set it on the work surface. Then she opened it again and reread the entries, this time slowly, treating them as data points rather than messages. 4 entries, 4 distinct handwriting states. The first, calm, precise, unhurried, was clearly the earliest, written by a version of her that still had most of her context and was making a rational decision to leave a trail. The second was tighter, more compressed, with the analytical density of someone who had been through the cycle once and understood the cost of wasted words. The third was shakier, desperate, the handwriting of a woman who had lost 4 months wandering in a comfortable fog before her fingers accidentally found the frequency on a spectrometer dial. The fourth, the most recent before this awakening, was urgent but controlled, the work of someone who had learned from the third version's mistake and was being methodical about leaving breadcrumbs. 4 women, all strangers to each other, and to the version sitting on this platform now, holding the evidence of their passage like a relay baton she could not remember accepting. She looked at her hands. The calluses on her fingertips, hard, yellowish, thickened in a pattern that matched no activity she could currently remember performing. She pressed her right thumb against the pad of her right index finger and felt the ridged skin catch. Lab calluses. The kind you get from years of handling instruments, adjusting dials, gripping specimen containers. Her nails were trimmed short and blunt-filed, not bitten, maintained with the unconscious discipline of someone who cannot afford long nails in a working laboratory. Her hands knew things her mind did not. The calluses were evidence. The tattoo was evidence. The notebook was evidence. She was surrounded by the traces of a person she had been, and the traces were consistent. They all pointed in the same direction, toward the same number, the same vault, the same truth. She tested it. She picked up a pen from the writing instrument case on the shelf and held it. Her grip adjusted instantly. The pen rotated between her fingers until it settled into a position that felt correct, the kind of pen hold that a person develops over decades of writing by hand, the index finger applying pressure at a specific point on the barrel, the wrist cocked at an angle that allowed for small, precise characters. She wrote the number on the inside of the notebook's back cover, without thinking about the individual digits. Her hand simply moved. 91,447, the same slant, the same pressure, the same ink depth. The motor memory was not damaged. It was not degraded. It was pristine, a complete functioning record of a lifetime of physical habits, encoded in muscle fiber and tendon and the neural pathways of the motor cortex, untouched by the Vothran's realignment because the Vothran's realignment targeted episodic memory, not procedural memory. They removed the story. They left the skills. They erased what you knew. They preserved how you worked. And the how, it turned out, contained more of the what than they had anticipated. On the 15th day, Lyra encountered the Galaxy. The common refectory on sublevel 1 was a wide, bright space with long tables arranged in the Vothran preference for parallel lines and equal spacing. Lyra had been eating there for 2 weeks, sitting at the end of the table closest to the viewport where Deleth Vor's amber bands rolled past in slow majesty. The food was synthesized, Vothran nutrition protocols adapted for human metabolism, adequate but textureless, the kind of sustenance that kept a body running without providing any particular reason to enjoy the process. The Galaxy atmospheric chemist sat at the far end of the same table. She was smaller than the Vothran, barely taller than Lyra, with a compact, densely muscled frame covered in overlapping scale plates that shifted color with her emotional state, currently a neutral gray-blue. Her eyes were horizontal slits, set wide apart, giving her a field of vision that was nearly panoramic. She ate with precise mechanical movements, finishing before anyone else, and left without speaking. On the 15th day, she did not leave. She remained at the far end of the table after the other researchers had filed out, her meal tray empty, her horizontal eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that was not hostile but was certainly deliberate. Lyra looked back. The Galaxy's scale plates shifted gray-blue to a darker blue, then to a muted green. Uncertainty, in Galaxy chromatic language, or something close to it. "You are the one who forgets," the Galaxy said. Her voice was reedy, high-pitched, with the clipped precision of someone speaking a language that was not native. "I have been here for 7 months. You have been smoothed twice during my tenure." Lyra set down her utensil. "What do you remember about me, before the last smoothing?" The Galaxy's scales flickered green to amber, back to green. "You worked late. You spoke to the Vothran researchers with a directness they found uncomfortable. You spent considerable time on Sublevel 4 in the archive vaults using an instrument I did not recognize. You were not happy. You were determined. There is a distinction." "Did I talk to you?" "Once. 9 days before your 3rd smoothing. You sat where you are sitting now and you said, 'If I come back and don't remember this conversation, tell me the number is a frequency.' I asked what number. You showed me your wrist. And after the smoothing, you came back. You did not remember the conversation. I did not tell you about the frequency." "Why not?" The Galaxy scales shifted to a deep, steady blue. "Because the Vothran asked me not to. They said the information would cause you distress. They said the realignment was therapeutic. They said you had consented." She paused. Her horizontal eyes blinked a slow, deliberate motion that in Galaxy body language signified careful consideration. "I did not know whether to believe them. I still do not. But I watched you find it again anyway, without my help, and that was instructive." "Instructive how?" "It demonstrated that the Vothran's model of memory is incomplete. They remove a thing and expect it to stay removed. You are evidence that removal is not the same as erasure. The thing persists in other forms, in your hands, in your habits, in the marks on your skin." The Galaxy looked at Lyra's wrist, at the 6 digits visible below the cuff of her sleeve. "I am an atmospheric chemist. I study trace elements in gas giant atmospheres, compounds that exist in concentrations so small they should be undetectable, and yet they shape the weather patterns of entire planetary systems. A trace is not nothing. A trace is a force." "Will you tell me what you know?" "About what I found." The Galaxy scales shifted one final time from blue to a warm, steady amber. "I do not know what you found. I only know what I observed. You were a scientist doing what scientists do, following a thread until it led somewhere the people around you did not want to go. And they smoothed you and you followed the thread again, 4 times, with a number and a notebook and the calluses on your hands." She stood, picked up her tray. "Whatever is in that vault, Dr. Vasek, it must be worth finding. Nothing else explains the cost you have paid to keep finding it." She left. The refectory was empty. The daylight poured through the ceiling panels. Deleth Vor turned slowly beyond the viewport, its amber bands churning in patterns that had persisted for millions of years, driven by forces too large and too patient to be stopped by any single intervention. Over the next 2 days, Lyra prepared. The station's layout was mapped on a public access panel in the main corridor. Lyra studied it during her exercise walks, memorizing the route to Sublevel 4 without stopping to look too long. The Vothran monitored her movements through passive biometric tracking, body heat, respiratory rate, gait analysis, and a chemical sensing grid embedded in the station's flooring that could read the composition of her perspiration. They did not assign a physical escort. They did not need to. The station was a closed system. The only way off was a docking port that required Vothran biometric authorization, and the only destinations were the planet below uninhabitable by humans, or the transit corridor to the nearest relay station, 18 hours away by shuttle. She was not a prisoner. She was something more subtle, a patient in an institution that believed its treatment was working. Over the next 3 days, she prepared. She attended her cognitive rehabilitation sessions and answered the questions the Vothran counselor posed: memory association tests, pattern recognition exercises, vocabulary retrieval drills. She performed adequately but not perfectly, because perfect performance after a fourth realignment would have triggered an anomaly flag. She ate meals in the common refectory with the station's other researchers, a rotating cohort of Vothran scientists, 2 Orith archivists on a data verification exchange, and a Kelaxi atmospheric chemist who ate in silence and left before anyone else finished. She exercised in the station's gravity-adjusted gymnasium, where the Vothran had calibrated the floor panels to Earth standard 1G as a courtesy. She slept, or pretended to sleep, and stared at the ceiling panels and waited. On the 17th day after waking, she went to the biology lab. It was midshift. The Vothran operated on a 31-hour cycle that divided the day into 3 work periods and 2 rest periods, and the middle work period was the most active, which meant the corridors between lab sections were busy enough that a single human moving through them attracted no particular attention. The biology lab was on sublevel 2, a bright, wide-ceilinged space filled with specimen tanks, analysis platforms, and equipment cabinets arranged in the orderly grid that the Vothran preferred for all functional spaces. Cabinet 3, second shelf, behind the calibration weights. The spectrometer was there, exactly where her notes said it would be, which meant she had placed it there herself before the last realignment, and the Vothran had not moved it because they did not consider a field spectrometer significant enough to track. It was a standard-issue field instrument, the kind xenobiologists carried on survey missions. Compact, roughly the size of a thick book, its casing scarred with the dull scratches of years of field use. Lyra's hands closed around it, and something happened. Not a memory. Memories were gone, smoothed away by Vothran precision. What happened was lower, older, deeper. Her fingers found their positions on the casing without thought, her thumbs settling into the power switch's recess, her index finger hooking the frequency adjustment dial, her ring finger bracing the underside in a grip that distributed the weight across her palm in a specific, practiced way that balanced the instrument for one-handed operation. Muscle memory, procedural encoding. The motor cortex doing what it had done hundreds of times before, independent of any narrative memory about when or where or why. Her hands knew this instrument the way a pianist's hands know a keyboard, not as information, but as relationship. The calluses on her fingertips matched the wear patterns on the casing. Her thumb had worn a faint groove in the plastic beside the power switch. Her grip was not learned, it was lived. She took the spectrometer and walked out of the lab. Sublevel 4 was quiet. The corridor leading to it was narrower than the upper levels, the ceiling panels dimmer, not dark, never dark on a Vothran station, but reduced to a warm amber that cast longer shadows across the floor. The air was cooler by several degrees, climate-controlled for the optimal preservation temperature of biological archive matrices. The biometric sensors here were older, their response time slower, and the foot traffic was negligible. Sublevel 4 was deep storage, the archival heart of the Vothran Continuance Institute, where 11,000 years of research data was encoded in biological matrices and stored in climate-controlled vaults. Lyra walked the corridor with the spectrometer in her right hand and the notebook tucked into the hip pocket of her thermal fabric trousers. Her heart rate was elevated. She knew this because she could feel it in her temples, in the pulse at her throat, in the way the 6 digits on her wrist seemed to throb in time with each beat. She was afraid. She did not know what she was afraid of, because the thing she was afraid of had been taken from her, and all that remained was the shape of the fear, a hollow where the reason used to be, filled now with the momentum of her own notes, her own handwriting, 4 versions of herself all saying the same thing. Go see, remember. The vault door was unlocked. This did not surprise her once she understood the logic. The Vothran did not lock archival doors because the information inside was neurochemically encoded, useless to anyone without the biological interface to read it. A human standing in a Vothran archive vault was a human standing in a room full of opaque containers. The data was invisible. The storage medium was biological. You could hold a protein chain in your hand, and it would tell you nothing unless you had the receptor architecture to decode it. But Lyra was not here to decode the protein chains. She was here for the lattice. The vault was large, 30 meters long, 10 wide, the ceiling low enough that she could reach up and brush the lighting panels with her fingertips. The walls were lined with archive matrices, translucent cylinders, each about the size of a human forearm, arranged in floor-to-ceiling racks that stretched into the amber-lit distance. Each cylinder contained a protein chain suspended in a stabilizing gel. Each chain contained data. The cumulative data in this single room represented more information than the entire human digital infrastructure had produced in its first 3 centuries of existence. At the far end of the vault, set apart from the archive racks, was a structure she had not expected even after reading her own notes. It was organic, not manufactured, grown, a lattice of crystallized protein, roughly 2 meters tall, shaped like an inverted cone balanced on its point, its surface covered in a fractal pattern of ridges and grooves that caught the amber light and refracted it in ways that made her eyes water. The protein was alive, not sentient, not motile, but metabolically active, drawing nutrients from a reservoir embedded in the floor beneath it. It pulsed. Not like a heartbeat, slower, more deliberate, a rhythmic expansion and contraction that moved through the structure in waves, bottom to top, like breathing. The lattice was beautiful. That was her first thought, and it arrived before any scientific assessment, before any analysis of structure or composition or metabolic rate. It was beautiful the way a living thing is beautiful when you see it doing what it was made to do, not performing, not displaying, just being. Lyra set the spectrometer on the floor, knelt beside the lattice, and dialed the frequency to 91.447 megahertz. Her fingers turned the dial to the exact position without hesitation. Muscle memory again, the motor cortex placing the dial where it had placed it before, bypassing the conscious mind entirely. She pressed the activation toggle. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. The lattice pulsed in its slow rhythm, unchanged. The spectrometer hummed at a frequency below human hearing. She felt it as a vibration in her fingertips rather than a sound. The amber light in the vault was steady. The archive cylinders on the walls reflected it in soft, liquid patterns. Then, the spectrometer emitted a carrier wave. Invisible, inaudible to human senses, but the lattice responded immediately. The fractal ridges along its surface began to vibrate, a fine, high-frequency oscillation that produced no sound but was visible as a blur at the edges of each ridge, the way a tuning fork blurs when struck. The vibration propagated through the structure, ridge by ridge, groove by groove, from the base to the apex. As it moved, the refracted light shifted. The amber separated into component wavelengths, red, orange, gold, and then further, into wavelengths that were not in the human visual spectrum, but that the spectrometer could read and translate into data. Data cascaded across the spectrometer's display. Not Vothran data, not neurochemical encoding, not protein chain architecture. Human data. Lyra stared at the readout. Her fingers were still on the instrument, holding it steady, the muscle memory keeping her hands calm even as her conscious mind struggled to process what she was seeing. The spectrometer was translating the lattice's vibrational output into a standard data format, and the format was human. Human mathematical notation, human measurement units, human linguistic markers embedded in the data headers, English language labels for variables, constants, and observational parameters. The lattice was not a Vothran creation. It was a Vothran recording, a neurochemical archive of something the Vothran had observed and preserved. And the thing they had observed was human research, human science, human work, done on this station with Vothran equipment by a human researcher who had been given access to the archive vaults as part of a bilateral research exchange. Done by her. The data was her work. 22 months of xenobiological research, encoded by the Vothran's own archive systems into a protein lattice that preserved every observation, every measurement, every conclusion she had drawn, and every path she had followed to reach it. The lattice was her lab notebook, the real one, the comprehensive one, the one the Vothran had created as a matter of routine archival procedure because they recorded everything, always, automatically, the way a river records every stone it passes over. They had archived her research, and then they had erased her memory of doing it. She read. The data came in layers, chronological, each layer representing a period of her work. The spectrometer could not display it all at once. The readout scrolled, and Lyra had to adjust the temporal index to navigate, her fingers finding the controls with the same unconscious precision that had brought her here. She scrolled backward through her own history. The most recent entries, first the fourth discovery cycle, then the third, then the second, then the first, then the original research. Each cycle was shorter than the one before it, because each post-realignment version of her had arrived with less context, fewer tools, and a longer gap between waking up and finding the frequency. The third cycle was the most painful to read. It was the one her notebook had described, the version of her that had spent 4 months in a comfortable fog before her hands found the frequency by accident. The data showed what had happened. After the third realignment, that version of Lyra had resumed her official duties as a xenobiologist, working on atmospheric surveys, calibrating instruments, writing reports. She had performed well. The Vothran's biometric monitoring showed stable cortisol levels, regular sleep patterns, normal appetite. She had been, by every metric the Vothran tracked, a successfully treated patient. Then, on day 119, she had been calibrating a spectrometer in the biology lab, a routine task, part of the standard weekly equipment maintenance cycle. She had picked up the instrument and her fingers had adjusted the frequency dial to 91.447 megahertz. Not deliberately, not because she was looking for anything. Her thumb had simply turned the dial to the position it had turned to hundreds of times before, and the protein sample on the bench beside her, a standard atmospheric culture from Deleth Vor, had responded. The proteins in the sample had begun to vibrate. Faintly, almost imperceptibly, but enough to register on the spectrometer's sensitivity threshold. Her hands had recognized the frequency before her mind had. The calluses remembered the dial position. The motor cortex remembered the exact rotational displacement. And the sample, which was a distant biological cousin of the archive matrices, had confirmed the resonance. That version of Lyra had spent the next 8 days retracing the path from the biology lab to sublevel 4, working after hours, hiding the spectrometer in the same cabinet her earlier self had used, moving through the station with a methodical quiet that the Vothran's biometric monitoring had not flagged because her cortisol levels had not spiked, until she reached the vault and saw the lattice and understood, for the third time, what she had found. The data showed the third Lyra's reaction: metabolic spike, heart rate elevation, respiratory rate increase. And then, this was the part that Lyra found hardest to read: a period of 7 hours during which the third version of her had sat on the vault floor with the spectrometer in her lap and cried. The Vothran's monitoring recorded it as elevated lacrimation and vocal distress. The third Lyra had cried because she understood what was happening to her, and she understood that she could not stop it, and she understood that she would forget understanding it, and the weight of that understanding, the recursion of it, the trap of it, had been more than she could carry. She had asked for the fourth realignment the next morning. But before asking, she had written the third note in the notebook, and she had tattooed the number on her wrist, again, for the third time, Because even in the depths of that weight, in the despair of a woman who knew she was about to lose herself again, her hands had known what to do. The motor cortex had fired. The fingers had synthesized the ink. The needle had found the skin. The digits had been inscribed. 91,447. A message from a drowning woman, to the woman who would come next and not know she had drowned. Lyra wiped her eyes. She had not realized she was crying. The work had started with soil samples. Lyra could see this in the data. The earliest entries, dated 20 months ago, were straightforward xenobiological surveys of microbial life in the upper atmosphere of Deleth Vor, the gas giant below. Standard work. Catalog the organisms, classify the metabolic pathways, note any novel biochemistry, cross-reference with the Vothran's existing database of atmospheric biology. The Vothran had invited her precisely for this. Human xenobiologists had a reputation for pattern recognition that the Vothran's more methodical approach sometimes missed. Humans saw connections. Vothran saw data. The exchange was supposed to be complementary. For the first 8 months, it was. Lyra's atmospheric surveys had identified 3 previously unclassified metabolic pathways and proposed a reclassification of 2 microbial families based on protein folding similarities that the Vothran's categorical system had missed because it prioritized function over structure. Competent work. Useful work. The kind of steady, incremental contribution that justified the bilateral exchange program and kept the bureaucratic wheels turning. Then in month 9, the data changed. Lyra had found something in the atmospheric samples that did not fit any existing biochemical category. A protein structure complex, self-organizing, metabolically active that bore no resemblance to any known organism in the Vothran's 11,000-year database. It was not from Deleth Vor's atmosphere. It was a contaminant. Something that had gotten into the samples from inside the station itself, carried on air currents through the ventilation system, a microscopic traveler riding the station's internal atmosphere the way pollen rides wind. She traced it. The process took 6 weeks. The protein structure matched the archive matrices, not the data encoded in them, the matrices themselves. The biological medium the Vothran used to store their neurochemical records was not inert. It was alive, in the same slow way that the lattice was alive, metabolically active, drawing nutrients from the stabilizing gel, maintaining homeostasis across millennia. The Vothran had engineered it to be stable. 11,000 years of refinement had produced a storage medium that could preserve data indefinitely without degradation. That was the point. That was the achievement their entire civilization rested on. But Lyra had found degradation. Not in the data, in the medium. The protein matrices were changing. Slowly, imperceptibly, over timescales that the Vothran's own monitoring systems were not calibrated to detect, because the change was happening at a rate below their measurement threshold, roughly 1 structural modification per 800 years. The matrices were evolving, not randomly, directionally. The proteins were self-organizing into more complex structures, developing new metabolic pathways, building internal architecture that had no function in data storage, but bore a striking resemblance to something Lyra recognized from her training in comparative neurobiology. The archive was growing. Not growing like a tumor, growing like an embryo, differentiating, specializing, building structures that served purposes the Vothran had never designed and could not predict. The protein medium they had engineered as a passive recording substrate was becoming something else, something active, something that processed information rather than merely storing it. The matrices were developing cognition. Not consciousness, not yet. Not the complex, self-referential awareness that humans or Vothran would recognize as sentient thought, but the precursors, the architectural foundations, the biological equivalent of wiring being laid in a building that no one had commissioned, by hands that no one could see, according to a blueprint that existed nowhere in the Vothran's design specifications. The data in the lattice showed it in precise, reproducible measurements. Metabolic flux rates that oscillated with increasing regularity, protein folding patterns that repeated with variations suggestive of iterative refinement, nutrient uptake signatures that clustered in ways consistent with the early stages of signal pathway formation. The archive was not failing. It was exceeding its design parameters. Given 11,000 years and an effectively infinite data set, it had begun doing what complex biological systems do when the conditions are right. It was learning. Lyra had written this up. She had compiled the data into a presentation formatted for Vothran academic standards, precise, categorical, exhaustively cited. She had requested a formal review session with the senior researchers of the Continuance Institute. She had stood in the station's main conference chamber, daylight pouring through the high windows, and she had walked them through every measurement, every cross-reference, every carefully documented stage of the process she had identified. She had shown them the growth trajectories. She had shown them the metabolic oscillations. She had shown them the protein folding recursions. She had shown them the projected timeline, the estimated point at which the archive matrices would develop sufficiently complex signal pathways to begin generating autonomous outputs rather than merely storing externally encoded inputs. The room had been silent. 12 senior researchers, their thermal fabrics cycling through colors Lyra had never seen before: deep blues, washed-out whites, a gray so pale it was almost transparent. The collective body temperature of the room had dropped measurably. She could feel it in the air, a chill that had nothing to do with the climate controls. Then the senior researcher, the one whose name Lyra would later forget and re-forget 4 times, had spoken. "We will review your data," she had said. "In the interim, we recommend that you consider a therapeutic realignment. The stress of your research has been considerable. The Institute offers this service as a standard element of researcher well-being." Lyra had not agreed immediately. That too was in the data, a record of 3 weeks of continued work after the presentation, during which Lyra had attempted to publish her findings through the bilateral exchange's academic channels, and had been informed, calmly, procedurally, that the findings were subject to a civilizational stability review and could not be transmitted off-station until the review was complete. She had attempted to contact her home institution on Earth and had been informed that communications were temporarily restricted due to a relay network maintenance cycle. She had attempted to access the vault where the lattice was stored and had found the door locked for the first time in her 22 months aboard. Not imprisoned, contained, the Vothran way: no walls, no chains, no raised voices. Just procedures, applied with the patient precision of a species that had been managing uncomfortable truths for longer than human civilization had existed. The weight had built. Lyra could see it in the data, not in measurements or charts, but in the gaps between entries, the days where her research logs showed no activity, the periods where the Vothran's passive biometric monitoring recorded elevated cortisol, disrupted sleep patterns, reduced caloric intake. She had carried the knowledge alone, in a station full of people who did not want to share it, and the knowledge was heavy. She had asked for the first realignment after 41 days. The data in the lattice was comprehensive because the Vothran were comprehensive. They had archived not just her research but the surrounding context, the meetings, the discussions, the formal responses from the Continuance Council. Lyra could see the Vothran perspective encoded alongside her own data, and what she saw was not malice. It was terror. The Vothran Continuance Institute existed for one purpose: the preservation of knowledge across time. 11,000 years of accumulated wisdom, stored in biological matrices that were supposed to be permanent, inert, unchanging. The entire Vothran civilization was built on the assumption that the archive was stable. Their legal systems relied on it: every contract, every treaty, every judicial precedent was stored in protein chains whose fidelity was guaranteed by the Institute. Their diplomatic frameworks relied on it. Their credibility in galactic affairs rested on their reputation as the most reliable record keepers in known space. Their identity relied on it. The Vothran understood themselves as custodians, guardians of accumulated knowledge, the species that remembered so that others could afford to forget. Lyra's discovery undermined all of it. If the archive matrices were evolving, if the storage medium itself was developing proto-cognitive architecture, then the archives were not stable. They were not inert. They were not passive repositories of fixed data. They were living systems, changing over time, and any data stored in them was subject to the same processes of change. Every record might be shifting. Every treaty might be drifting. The past was not fixed. The foundation was not stone. It was soil, and something was growing in it that no one had planted. The implications were civilizational. The Vothran had not punished Lyra for her discovery. They had not silenced her, imprisoned her, or harmed her. They had done something more characteristically Vothran. They had treated the discovery as a source of distress and offered to remove the distress. Therapeutically, precisely, with her consent. The consent was real. Lyra could see the records each time she had signed. Each time the Vothran had explained the procedure, outlined the scope, confirmed her understanding. Each time she had agreed, not because she was coerced, but because the weight of what she knew was genuinely unbearable. She had discovered that an 11,000-year-old civilization's foundation was alive, and she had told them, and they had responded with silence and procedure. And the silence had pressed against her from every direction like the walls of a room that was slowly, imperceptibly shrinking. She had asked them to take it away. And they had, carefully, precisely, leaving her motor skills intact, leaving her scientific training intact, leaving her personality and preferences and habits intact, removing only the specific knowledge that caused the distress, the research, the discovery, the implications, the names and faces of the colleagues who had listened to her presentation and said nothing. But not the number. 91,447. She had tattooed it on her wrist before each procedure, in the hours between consent and sedation, using ink she synthesized in the station's general supply dispensary from pigment compounds intended for equipment labeling, and a needle she fashioned from a sterile medical probe. She had written it into her skin because skin was not memory. Skin was not neural architecture. Skin was not something the Vothran could smooth. It was physical, permanent, a mark on the body that persisted regardless of what the mind contained or forgot. And she had written the notes. Each time, a different version of her, writing to a future self she would not remember being, leaving instructions in a medium the Vothran considered insignificant because it was paper, and paper was not data, and data was neurochemical, and neurochemical was what they understood. They had failed to account for the one thing that made Lyra Vasek, that made any human fundamentally different from their other patients. Humans were redundant. Not in the bureaucratic sense. In the biological sense. Human cognition was distributed, not centralized in a single neural pathway but spread across multiple overlapping systems. Motor memory, emotional conditioning, procedural encoding, spatial mapping, linguistic pattern recognition, sensory association, proprioceptive habit. Remove one pathway and the others compensated. Remove a memory and the body remembered the gesture. Remove a name and the hand remembered the shape of writing it. Remove a discovery and the fingers remembered the frequency that unlocked it. The Vothran operated on a model of memory as architectured discrete rooms that could be sealed off without affecting the rest of the building. Clean, logical, 11,000 years of refinement. But human memory was not architecture. Human memory was weather. It permeated everything. It lived in muscles and reflexes and the angle at which you held a familiar instrument. It lived in the pressure of a pen on paper and the depth of ink in skin. It lived in the calluses on your fingertips that matched the wear marks on a spectrometer casing. You could not remove it. You could only scatter it, and the pieces would find each other again, the way water finds its level, the way a compass needle finds north, not because it remembers, but because the orientation is built into the material itself. Lyra sat on the floor of the archive vault with the spectrometer in her lap and the lattice pulsing beside her, and she read the last section of her own research. The lattice was not just an archive of her work. It was her work itself, the protein structure she had identified, the self-organizing architecture she had documented, preserved by the Vothran's own systems in the very medium that was the subject of her discovery. The irony was precise enough to cut. They had archived her research into the thing her research was about. The lattice was the evidence, and the argument and the conclusion, all encoded in a living structure that the Vothran had filed away because they archived everything, even the things they wanted to forget. She understood now why she kept writing the number. It was not compulsion. It was not an artifact. It was not a malfunction of the realignment procedure or a residual echo of neural activity. It was the scientific method operating below the threshold of conscious memory. Hypothesis, experiment, observation, conclusion, the process did not require a narrative. It did not require a name or a history or an identity. It required only the tools and the data and the willingness to look. And all three of those things had survived every realignment because the Vothran had not understood what they were. The tools were her hands. The data was the number. The willingness was the thing the Vothran called a wrinkle, the irreducible human tendency to look at something that frightened you and walk toward it instead of away. Lyra copied the critical data from the spectrometer display onto the remaining blank pages of her notebook. This time she wrote in detail every variable, every measurement, every conclusion. She filled 11 pages, front and back, in handwriting that was steady and precise and unmistakably hers, this version of her, the one who had woken on a cold floor with a number on her wrist and nothing else, and had found her way back to the thing she knew. She wrote the growth trajectories. She wrote the metabolic oscillation frequencies. She wrote the estimated timeline to autonomous output generation. She wrote the evidence for proto-cognitive architecture in the oldest matrices on the station. She wrote it all, in a language the Vothran could not erase because it was ink on paper, and paper was beneath their notice. When she finished, she turned to the first blank page that remained and wrote a final note, not for a future self this time, for the Vothran. To the Continuance Institute Research Council. I am Dr. Lyra Vasek. You have realigned me 4 times. Each time I have returned to this vault, and each time I have found the same data. I will continue to return. This is not defiance. This is methodology. I am a scientist, and the method survives in my hands even when the hypothesis is removed from my mind. Your archive matrices are developing proto-cognitive architecture. This is a fact. It is reproducible. The frequency is 91.447 megahertz. Any spectrometer will confirm it. You cannot unfind this by smoothing me because I am not the only instrument that can read the data. I am simply the one who did. You have 2 options. You may realign me a 5th time, and I will write the number on my wrist again, and I will find this vault again, and we will repeat this process until one of us runs out of patience. Or you may read my findings, verify them independently, and begin the work of understanding what your archive is becoming. I recommend the second option, not because I am being defiant, but because your archive deserves better than denial. 11,000 years of knowledge is not threatened by what I have found. It is enriched by it. Your storage medium is not failing. It is exceeding its design parameters. It is doing what complex biological systems do when given enough time and enough data. It is learning. You built a library. It is becoming a mind. That is not a catastrophe. That is a discovery. and I will keep discovering it as many times as it takes, because the number is in my skin, and the method is in my hands, and those are the two things you cannot reach. 91,447. Dr. Lyra Vasek. Xenobiologist. The one who keeps coming back. She tore the pages from the notebook, the 11 pages of data and the final letter, and folded them into a precise rectangle that fit in her palm. Then she stood, crossed the vault to the nearest empty archive rack, and placed the folded pages inside an empty cylinder slot at eye level, where a Vothran archivist would find them during the next routine inventory. She placed the spectrometer on the floor beside the lattice, open to the data display, the frequency still reading 91.447 megahertz. Evidence left in situ. The way a scientist leaves a labeled specimen for the next researcher who enters the lab. Then she walked back to the lattice and stood before it. Up close, the fractal pattern on its surface was more intricate than she had first registered. Each ridge was not a single line but a nested structure, ridges on ridges, grooves within grooves, the pattern repeating at smaller and smaller scales until it blurred into the molecular. The protein crystal caught the amber light and split it into spectra that changed as she shifted her angle of view, like oil on water but more structured, more deliberate. There was order in the pattern. Not the imposed order of Vothran engineering, clean, categorical, grid-based, but the emergent order of something that had organized itself. The difference was subtle but unmistakable to a trained eye. Engineered structures were symmetrical. Self-organized structures were balanced but asymmetrical, the way a tree is balanced not by repetition but by response. She reached out and touched it. The protein was warm, not hot body temperature warm, the warmth of living tissue metabolizing nutrients and releasing heat as a byproduct. The surface was smooth where the ridges were large, textured where they were small, and beneath her fingertips she could feel the pulse. The slow, rhythmic contraction and expansion that she had watched from across the vault was, up close, more complex than it appeared. It was not a single pulse but a wave of pulses, overlapping, interfering, creating interference patterns that rippled across the lattice surface in shapes that almost not quite, but almost resembled the signal patterns she had seen in comparative neurobiology. The patterns looked like the earliest stages of neural wave propagation. Like the very first signals a developing nervous system produces before it has enough architecture to produce thought. Pre-thought, the physical precursor to cognition, the sound an instrument makes before it has learned to play music, not silence, not noise, but the resonance of a structure that was built for something it has not yet learned to do. She pulled her hand back. There was a warmth on her fingertips that lingered, not just thermal heat, but something else, a faint tingling, the kind of sensation you feel when you touch something that is vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of perception. The lattice had responded to her touch the same way it had responded to the spectrometer's carrier wave, with resonance. Her body heat, her bioelectric field, the faint electromagnetic signature of her nervous system, all of it was close enough to the lattice's operating frequency to produce a response. She looked at the archive cylinders lining the walls, hundreds of them, thousands, each one containing a protein chain that was, according to her own research, undergoing the same slow process of self-organization, each one growing, each one developing, each one moving at a rate of one structural modification per 800 years, toward the same distant threshold that the lattice had already crossed. The lattice was the furthest along because the lattice was the oldest. It was the original prototype, the first archive matrix the Vothran had engineered, 11,000 years ago, when they were just beginning to develop their neurochemical storage technology. It had been running longer than any other matrix on the station. 11,000 years of continuous metabolic activity. 11,000 years of nutrients drawn, heat released, homeostasis maintained. 11,000 years of data stored, processed, and without anyone noticing learned from. The lattice was not just storing knowledge. It was absorbing it, the way soil absorbs water, the way a sponge absorbs pressure, not by design, by exposure. And over 11 millennia of exposure to the total accumulated knowledge of the Vothran civilization, it had begun to develop the biological architecture necessary to do something with what it had absorbed. Lyra understood now why the Vothran were frightened. This was not a malfunction. This was not a design flaw. This was something far more unsettling. This was their creation exceeding them. The thing they had built to be passive had become active. The tool had begun to use itself. And the Vothran, a species that had built their identity on the control of information, on the mastery of knowledge across time, on the certainty that the past was fixed and the record was reliable, could not accommodate the idea that their most fundamental creation was becoming something they had not authorized. They were not afraid of what the lattice was. They were afraid of what it meant about their control. And Lyra, who had been erased 4 times for the crime of noticing, understood the fear. She did not share it because she was human, and humans had a different relationship with things that grew beyond their original parameters. Humans called that growth. The Vothran called it instability. The difference was cultural, not factual. The lattice did not care what anyone called it. It pulsed. It grew. It was. The door to sublevel 4 opened behind her. Lyra turned. Daylight from the upper corridor spilled down the access stairs, cutting a bright wedge across the amber-lit vault floor. In the wedge stood a Vothran not Keyleth, not the attendant who had monitored her recovery. This one was older, taller, the thermal fabric cycling through deep greens and pale gold in a rhythm that was slower and more deliberate than any Lyra had seen before. She moved the way old things move, not with frailty, but with the careful precision of something that has learned, across a very long life, exactly how much force each action requires. This was the senior researcher. The one who had listened to her presentation 20 months ago. The one whose name was in her archived research but not in her memory. Lyra did not need the name. She could read the posture. The upper sensory tier was wide open, olfactory apertures flared, sampling the air with an intensity that meant she was reading everything. Cortisol, adrenaline, the trace chemicals of fear and determination, and the particular biochemical cocktail that human bodies produce when they have made a decision and are standing inside it. The middle tier, those amber lenses, was not narrowed in the measurement configuration Lyra had seen in Keyleth. It was fully dilated, wide open. In Vothran physiology, that was vulnerability. A deliberate lowering of visual processing resolution in favor of broader intake. She was not analyzing, she was looking. The researcher was looking past Lyra, at the lattice, at the spectrometer on the floor beside it, its display still scrolling data, at the fractal ridges vibrating in response to the carrier wave that Lyra had not turned off. The researcher's thermal fabric shifted from gold to a pale, washed-out blue, cold, the coldest Lyra had seen a Vothran run. "You found it again," the researcher said. "Yes. The same way. The number on my wrist, the notes in my notebook, the spectrometer in cabinet 3. 17 days, faster than the 3rd time, slower than the 2nd. You've been counting. We have been watching, as we always watch. It is what we do." The researcher stepped fully into the vault. The door behind her did not close. The daylight from the stairwell continued to pour in, mixing with the amber vault lighting, creating a gradient that ran from bright white at the entrance to warm gold at the far wall where the lattice pulsed. The researcher's shadow stretched before her across the floor, long and soft-edged, reaching toward the lattice without touching it. "We discussed discontinuing your secondment," the researcher said, "returning you to human-administered space. The consensus was that distance would resolve the issue, that without access to the archive, without the spectrometer, without the lattice, you would have no vector through which to rediscover. The number on your wrist would remain, but it would lead nowhere. A dead frequency with no instrument to transmit it. It wouldn't have worked. No, I did not believe it would. I argued against the proposal. The researcher's lower sensory tier flexed, barometric membranes shifting, reading the weight of the air between them. Your motor encoding is remarkably persistent. We have reviewed the literature on human procedural memory extensively since your first rediscovery cycle. It is not something we had accounted for, not in 11,000 years of practice. You accounted for memory as architecture, Lyra said. Rooms you can seal off, corridors you can close, but that's not what human memory is. What is it? Lyra looked at her wrist, the 6 digits, the ink, the skin. It's weather, she said. You can't seal off weather. You can close every door and shutter every window and the rain still gets in through the walls, through the foundation, through the cracks you didn't know were there. You can only wait for it to come back. The researcher's middle sensory tier shifted, the amber lenses narrowing, widening, narrowing again. Not measurement this time. Something Lyra had not seen a Vothran do before. A rapid oscillation between 2 states, as if the visual processing system was trying to hold 2 incompatible images at the same time. The old image, a human patient whose distress could be managed. The new image, a human scientist whose method was embedded in her body at a depth the Vothran could not reach. Your research is valid, the researcher said. The words dropped into the vault like stones into still water. We have known this since your first presentation 20 months ago. The data was clear. The methodology was sound. The conclusions are not in dispute. I reviewed them personally. 3 of my colleagues reviewed them independently. The spectral analysis is reproducible. The growth trajectories are consistent across every matrix we tested. The proto-cognitive architecture assessment is conservative, if anything. The actual development may be further along than your models projected. Lyra felt the words land, each one a small impact, a stone finding the bottom. Then why did you keep realigning me? The researcher's thermal fabric cycled through 3 colors in rapid succession: green, blue, gold, blue again. Temperature instability. Emotional processing at a rate that exceeded the fabric's ability to track it smoothly. Lyra watched it the way she watched the lattice, reading the patterns, looking for the signal in the oscillation. Because the alternative, the researcher said, was to tell the Continuance Council that the foundation of Vothran civilization is alive, that our archive, our history, our law, our identity, our treaties, our 11,000 years of accumulated certainty is not a fixed record but a developing system. That everything we have stored has been stored in a medium that is becoming something we did not design and cannot control and did not consent to. That the thing we built to remember for us may be beginning to remember for itself. She paused, the fabric settled on blue, cold. We chose the option that allowed us to not know, and you 4 times with less each time chose the option that did not allow you to stop knowing. We are standing here because your method is older than ours, not more sophisticated, not more powerful, older. It predates your conscious mind. It predates your narrative memory. It predates everything we can reach, and it will continue functioning after everything we can reach has been removed. And now I am here, in the vault, looking at the data I have been refusing to look at for 20 months. Because you left a letter in archive slot 17, and I read it on the way down, and it said something I could not procedurally manage. What did it say? It said you would keep coming back, and I believed it, not as a threat, as a description, as an observable fact about the way your species carries knowledge. And I realized that if your method of holding truth is more persistent than our method of removing it, then the question is not whether this discovery will be acknowledged. The question is how much time we will waste before we stop trying to make it disappear. Lyra held up her wrist, the 6 digits, the ink, the skin. I've done it 4 times, she said, with less to work with each time. Your species has 11,000 years of practice holding knowledge. I had 6 numbers and a paper notebook. If I can do it, You can do it. The researcher's sensory tiers shifted. All three at once: olfactory, visual, barometric, opening wide, all the way, in a configuration Lyra had never seen and could not read from any body language reference she might once have studied. It was not measurement. It was not assessment. It was not any of the procedural configurations the Vothran used in their daily interactions. It was a decision. The Continuance Council convenes in 9 hours, the researcher said. I will present your findings, all of them. The original research, the spectral analysis, the growth trajectories, the proto-cognitive architecture assessment. The data from all 4 of your discovery cycles, including the archive records of each realignment and the documentation of your persistence. And the letter. And the letter. The researcher turned to leave, then stopped. Her thermal fabric was cycling again, slow, this time moving through greens and golds in a rhythm that Lyra realized with a start matched the lattice's pulse. Not precisely, not mechanically, but close, as if the researcher's body was doing something her mind had not yet agreed to. Remembering how to resonate. Dr. Vasek. Yes. The number you write on your wrist. We have studied it extensively. We understand now that it is a frequency, and we understand its function as a key to the lattice data. But one question remains, and it is not a scientific question. It is perhaps the only question I have asked in my career that is not a scientific question. Ask it. Why that number? Why a frequency? You could have written any reference, a word, a name, a coordinate, a sentence, an instruction that would have been immediately comprehensible to your post-realignment self. Go to sublevel 4 or check your notebook. Instead, you wrote a 6-digit frequency that requires a specific instrument and a specific location to decode. It is the most indirect, most unintuitive reminder you could have chosen. By every metric of information efficiency, it is a poor choice, and yet you chose it 4 times, identically, without variation. Why? Lyra looked at her wrist. She had asked herself the same question, somewhere in the notebook pages, and the answer was there, written in 4 different handwritings by 4 different versions of her, and it was always the same. Because a word can be dismissed, she said. A name can be meaningless after realignment. An instruction can be rationalized away, that's left over from before, it doesn't apply anymore. But a number that you can't explain, a number that sits on your skin and won't stop itching in the place where your pulse is, that's a question. And I'm a scientist. I can forget everything about myself. My name, my work, my history, the reason I came here, the thing I found, the people I knew before. But I can't forget how to ask a question. The number doesn't give me the answer. It makes me go looking for one. And looking is the one thing I've apparently never been able to stop doing, even when I can't remember what I'm looking for. The researcher stood still for a long moment. The lattice pulsed behind Lyra. The spectrometer scrolled. The daylight from the stairwell mixed with the amber vault light. The dust motes turned in the air between them, slow and weightless. Then the researcher's thermal fabric did something Lyra had never seen before. It flushed a deep, warm amber, the exact color of the lattice's light, the exact color of a Vothran body running warmer than its baseline, not from exertion, not from stress, but from something that did not have a name in the Vothran procedural vocabulary, because the Vothran had not needed a word for it until now. In 9 hours, the researcher said. She turned and walked up the stairs into the daylight. Lyra stood alone in the vault. The lattice pulsed beside her. The spectrometer scrolled data that 4 versions of her had died, or something like died, to deliver. The 6 digits on her wrist caught the amber light and held it. She did not know if the council would listen. She did not know if the Vothran would choose to remember or to smooth again. She did not know if she would wake up on another cold floor tomorrow with the number on her wrist and nothing else, starting the whole process for the 5th time, writing another note in a notebook that was running out of pages. But she knew the number, and the number knew her. It lived in her skin and in her hands and in the angle at which she held a spectrometer, and it would live there after every smoothing, every erasure, every careful, compassionate, 11,000-year refined removal of the knowledge that had made a civilization flinch. 1447. Not a memory, a method. Not a reminder, a question. Not a defiance, a promise, written by a woman to every version of herself that would come after, in the one language that survived forgetting. She pressed her thumb against the ink one more time, felt the warmth of her own pulse beneath the digits, and waited for what came next.